Sometimes the ending of one story prepares the way for another one. That was part of the creative genius of the original 3 Star Wars movies. People enjoyed the first one, and then they enjoyed the second one, and then they enjoyed the third one. But it's also true in our lives. Often the closing of one chapter of our lives is preparation for the next. Now, our messages this summer are from the Old Testament, and we're looking at a variety of Old Testament characters. The word character suggesting some of these characters are good examples for us, and some of these characters are not so good. But we're not just getting inspiration and encouragement and challenge from the example of the character. A side benefit of this, hopefully for many of us, is that we're gaining knowledge of this very important part of the Bible that we call the Old Testament. Now, we come this morning to a man named Gehazi. Different people pronounce these Old Testament names differently, but I think the best pronunciation is Gehazi. And today's account, looking at Gehazi, is a continuation of the narrative that we looked at last Sunday. Today we continue in 2 Kings chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 15 to 27. If you have your Bible, you can open it right there to 2 Kings chapter 5. Everything, for the most part, is going to be included there. And we do have, as you noticed, the overhead working today, and also the scriptures will be up there. But I want us to first meet this man named Gehazi. He was the ministry assistant of the prophet Elisha. Now that's Elisha, S-H-A, not the prophet Elijah. Elijah is the prophet that preceded Elisha, and actually Elisha, I think, was Elijah's ministry assistant. And in a couple of weeks, our director of student ministries, Garrett, is going to talk to us about the prophet Elijah. And we first meet Gehazi in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 12, where he's introduced as Elisha's servant. And he's significantly involved in 2 Kings chapter 4, assisting in the work. And while he's not specifically mentioned by name in the first 18 verses of 2 Kings 5, he is present there in connection with the healing of the Syrian commander Naaman of leprosy. Now, to set the stage for today, I want to review briefly what we looked at last week. This man named Naaman was a distinguished military commander in the Syrian or Aramean army, and yet he had leprosy. And he learned from a girl that they had captured from Israel about this prophet Elisha in Israel who could do some pretty wonderful things. And she suggested that maybe Elisha could help him. So he went to his king, Naaman did, this army commander, and got permission to go to Israel for healing. The first thing he did, he went to the king of Israel, who could do nothing for him. And he was a little shaken, but he sent Naaman to Elisha. And when he got to Elisha's place, Elisha didn't even come out to meet him, but sent out a messenger, whom I think was Gehazi, with instructions, if he wanted to be healed, to go down to the Jordan River and dip 7 times in the river. Well, this really ticked Naaman off. I think it ticked him off that Elisha didn't come out, but sent out a messenger. I think it ticked him off that Elisha asked him to immerse himself 7 times in the Jordan River. He wasn't happy at all. And the transition to what happened then, his staff who traveled with him from Aramea or Syria encouraged him to go ahead and follow the instructions. And when he did go down to the Jordan River and dipped himself the 7th time, his leprosy was healed. And the transition to what we want to consider today is in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. After he was healed, then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. That's Elisha. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there's no God in all the world except Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. Now, why did Elisha refuse this gift from Naaman? I mean, if you were here last week, we asked the question, would there have been anything wrong with that? When I was 20 years old, I was the youth pastor of a church in the greater Cincinnati area. And one Saturday afternoon, I went to these people's house, scheduled, and in their pool baptized 2 teenage daughters. The father had asked me to do this, and we'd worked it out, and they had a little cookie and Kool-Aid time. And afterwards, his father gave me a check for $35. And I mean, I was really shaken up. I didn't know what to do. I said, that's not necessary. There's no charge for baptisms, And he said, I want you to have it. So I was really concerned about this. So the next Monday, I went into the senior pastor's office. I said, Mr. Irby, I said, Mr. So-and-so gave me this $35. What do you think I should do? Mr. Irby was a great man. I loved him so much. He said, well, I'll tell you what I think you should do. He said, I think you should cash a check and enjoy spending the money. We don't do things that we do in terms of ministry to be paid. And sometimes it's appropriate to accept a gift from someone, and sometimes it isn't. Now, if you were here last week, we suggested that one of Naaman's mistakes in coming from Syria to Israel to find Elisha was that he thought he could buy his cleansing. And we suggested last week you cannot buy healing from God, you cannot buy forgiveness from God, you cannot buy blessings from God. And Chuck Swindoll, I think, is right when he accepts that Elisha did not accept this monetary gift from Naaman because he did not want to reinforce, or he wanted to reinforce the lesson that there's no charge to receive a blessing from God. Now, the stage is set for what we want to talk about today in verse 20 of 2 Kings chapter 5. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, my master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So with this plan before us, I want to highlight 5 self-serving acts of Gehazi that got him into trouble. And these are all borrowed from Chuck Swindoll in the book he wrote about this very matter. But note first that Gehazi pursued the goods. Look at verse 21 of 2 Kings 5. So Gehazi hurried after Naaman. When Naaman saw him running toward him, he got down from the chariot to meet him. Is everything all right? See, just as things had settled down, Gehazi decided, I'm going to get something, and he took off, and he was moving faster than Naaman and his group. And when Naaman saw him in the rearview mirror, or whatever, he said, this guy's, so he stopped, he said, what's going on here? And he talked to him. So the second thing that Gehazi did here was he crafted an elaborate lie. Look at verse 22. Everything is all right, Gehazi answered. My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent, that's an amount of money, a talent of silver, and 2 sets of clothing. Now, you and I know that there weren't 2 poor prophets who had just showed up at Ephraim needing supplies from the head prophet Elisha. Gehazi cooked this up, this elaborate lie, to make sure that he could get some goods from the rich commander from Syria. Now, the thing about Gehazi here that we need to note is he used his position as Elisha's ministry assistant to get money from this new believer who was so grateful for God's blessing upon him of granting him healing. And those of us who are involved in official ministry positions or helpers or assistants or whatever it is must always guard ourselves from ever using the privilege that we have of this role of ministry to get something from anybody else. So the third thing he did was he received what did not belong to him. Look at verse 23. By all means, take 2 talents. Gehazi had asked for 1. Naaman gives him 2. He urged Gehazi to accept them, like he would have to do that, and then tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead of Gehazi. Not only did he give him what he asked for, he gave him more than what he asked for, and he sent 2 of his servants to help Gehazi lug back to headquarters the take. Any gift that Naaman would have given to Gehazi would have rightly belonged to Elisha, the one to whom Naaman had originally offered it. And not only that, what Naaman now did give to Gehazi was intended for a couple of poor Bible college students who had just come on the scene and didn't have enough resources to continue their education. It was not for Gehazi. He took what didn't belong to him. Note next how he concealed his actions in verse 24. When Gehazi came to the hill, apparently there's a hill going back to headquarters there, he took the things from the servants and put them away in the house. He sent the men away, and they left. He hid his take in his quarters, concealed, kept those 2 servants who had helped him carry everything away from Elisha, and hid, concealed the things that he'd done. He did not want Elisha to know anything about it. And then finally, he lied without hesitation to his boss in verse 25. When he went in and stood before his master, Elisha asked him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Gehazi answered. Kind of reminds me of a teenager responding to their parents. "Where have you been?" "Nowhere." "What have you been doing?" "Nothing." And that's about all you get out of it. Now, you'd think Gehazi would have hesitated to lie to this prophet. I mean, he'd worked for him for a long time. He knew Elisha had a special relationship with the Lord, and I think he got so caught up in his plan he forgot that this is probably going to be found out. And of course it was, and we'll come to that in a moment. But I want to look at these 5 self-serving acts of Gehazi to give ourselves some abiding lessons, some practical application. The first, I think there's some words of instruction in this about greed for us. Before we attempt to define greed, perhaps we should say that greed is not limited to money. We usually think of greedy people as those who are trying to amass lots and lots of money, but greed relates to anything that we're trying to get more and more and more and more and more of just for ourselves. It includes not just money and things, but importance, prestige, fame. It even includes the things in life that give us pleasure and things related to that. And when it comes to greed, I think there's some precursors to greed that can tip us off to this growing problem in our lives. Greed often begins with discontentment. That is, a person will not be happy with or satisfied with what they already have. They're discontent. And then secondly, their discontentment leads to covetousness. That is, if you're not happy or satisfied with what you have, the next step often is that you begin to want or desire what someone else has, and that's what covetousness is. And remember, coveting is one of God's top 10 in terms of the 10 Commandments. We're not to covet what our neighbor has. So out of our discontentment, we've become covetous, and out of our covetousness, we often become resentful of what other people have that we don't have, that we wish that we could have. Whenever you want what you do not have, and then begin to get what you wanted so badly and begin to accumulate it and hold on to it, you may move to the sin of greed. Tony Campolo writes, "Greed can never be satisfied. The more the greedy get, the more they want. The more they want, the more discontented they are with what they have." And so when we think about what we have, we might ask ourselves 3 questions. First, how did we get it? How did we get what it is that we have? How did we come to accumulate this? Now, with regard to what Gehazi got in today's account, we see how he manipulated the circumstances and lied to get what he got. Chuck Swindoll says a greedy person will sacrifice his or her ethical standards when it blocks the path of the object they desire. So we have to be careful about how we accumulate what we have. Then we should ask ourselves the question, how do we view what we have? Now that we have it, what does it mean to us? Does it make us feel smug? Does having what we have make us think that we're better than people who don't have what we have? Their house isn't as big as ours. Their car's not as nice as ours. Their computer's not as fast as mine. Their clothes aren't as up to date as ours. I'm better than these other people because they don't have what I have. It makes me special. Tony Campolo writes, greed motivates people to buy things just for the sake of having them. It gives the person who possesses it a deluded sense of superiority. Somehow we think we're better than other people if we have more than they have. And the last question we should ask ourselves is, how do we use what it is we have? Do we selfishly keep it and hoard it and save it all for ourselves? Or do we share it with other people so they can enjoy it and benefit as well? Swindoll says greed is an excessive or reprehensible desire to acquire something only for the benefit of oneself. With those words of instruction, there's also a word of warning here. Let's go back and read what happened after this in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 26 and 27. But Elisha said to him, "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes or olive groves and vineyards or flocks and herds or male and female slaves? Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever." Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. Can you imagine the shame and embarrassment that Gehazi must have felt when confronted by his mentor, who knew everything that had taken place? And can you imagine, even worse than that, the disappointment that Elisha must have felt in confronting this man who had faithfully served him for all these years? I'm sure Elisha didn't take any pleasure in pointing out to Gehazi that he knew what he had done. And in terms of affirmation this morning, even though they're not technically my ministry assistants, I want you to know this morning what a blessing to me those who work on this church staff are. Some of them have been with me on this staff for more than 20 years. At least a couple of them have been a part of this church for more than 20 years, even though they haven't worked for the church for the full time. Some have been here 14 years, over 10 years. We have one who was on staff, off staff, and back on staff again. And I want you to know that my regularly working with and being around these dedicated believers in Jesus will be one of the things I miss the most when I step down from this position in October. I believe Gehazi had assisted and served Elisha for a long time before he took this misstep. And I think there's a word of warning for us here, and it's this: greed. And a variety of other sins related to greed can creep into a person's life after a number of years of faithful service. And you and I, as followers of Jesus, can never lower our guard, as it were, no matter how long we've followed Jesus as a Christian or worked in ministry. So here's an extension of the warning. We need to be on the lookout in our lives for discontentment, for envy, for resentment, and for covetousness. And rather than rationalize it when we become aware that that might be rearing its head in our lives, we need to confess it and repent of it. We all face the danger of rationalizing what we're doing when we're doing something that relates to these kinds of sins. Chuck Swindoll suggests that we can imagine what Gehazi might have been thinking about Naaman as he chased him that day. This man has millions. Now, if he didn't have plenty, he wouldn't have offered such lavish gifts. It's only right that we accept something of what he brought to us. Elisha shouldn't have kept him from doing what he really was led to do in his heart. The Lord has led this general to make us this offer. And then maybe what Gehazi was even thinking about Elisha. My master has plenty, but I have virtually nothing. He hasn't given me a raise for years. I've served him faithfully and diligently. Maybe he doesn't need what Naaman wants him to have, but my family and I can use these God-provided provisions that Naaman has brought. Perhaps we should be reminded regularly of what Jesus said about greed in Luke chapter 12, verse 15. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions. Then I think there's thirdly a word of challenge here for us, and that word of challenge is simply don't allow anything like Gehazi allowed into his life into your life. Regularly check your attitude towards things, stuff, money, and others. Take note if you find yourself wanting things too much and resenting those who have more. Examine your motives. You know, I'm going to have to move out of my office here where I've been for 30 years and a couple months, and I have hundreds of books. Hundreds of books. And Jan tells me that we don't have room in our house for those hundreds of books. So if we kick out the dog and the cat and your son, so what am I going to do with these books? I don't want to give up those books. But why do I need 10 commentaries on the book of Revelation? Do I need Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament? Do I need all those books? I don't. So what I've decided to do, I'm going to give one or two of them to Dan. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. I'm going to give several of them to Dan. I'm going to give some to Garrett and others. And then I'm going to take a bunch of them and donate them to the library at Hope International University, where I'm an adjunct professor. My motive, I mean, while I would like to keep those books, there's no reason for me to keep them. And I want to challenge you today, especially when it comes to handling money, dealing with money. Always do it in the open. Always be above board. So then you will never be able to fool yourself into thinking that something is right that is actually wrong. Finally, there's a word of encouragement here. Although Gehazi's act of sin did bring the consequence of leprosy for him and his family, I don't think that meant that he could never be of service again to the Lord. Some people think that he never served again, but I don't. He's not mentioned by name in 2 Kings 6:15, but the phrase, the servant of the man of God, is there. And I'm convinced that Gehazi, and even though Elisha isn't mentioned in 2 Kings 8:4, Gehazi is mentioned as the servant of the man of God. And I want to tell you something this morning, my brothers and sisters in Christ. Failure and sin in a person's life does not forever bar that person from future service and ministry to the Lord. Now, there are often consequences as a result of our failings and sin, but they do not render us totally useless in the future service of our Father. And aren't you glad? Because you see, if failure and sin in a person's life ruled that person never, ever in the future to be able to serve God, there'd be no servants of God. Our church wouldn't have any leaders. We wouldn't have anyone on our staff. And we wouldn't have a senior pastor. I hope all of us can look to Gehazi and hear from his experience these words of instruction, warning, challenge, and encouragement. As the band comes, remember how we began this talk today. Sometimes the ending of one story prepares the way for another one. And that's true of fictional stories and books and movies. but it's also true in our lives. One closing chapter of our lives can be the preparation for the next. And I wonder this morning if today could be that for you. If it's a problem for you, could you close the chapter on greed in your life today and move to a new one? Or being discontented or covetous or resentful of others? Or if lust is a problem for you, which is very similar to covetousness, could you close that chapter today and begin to move into a new chapter? Or what if it's just being a negative, judgmental crank with pretty much everyone around you? Could today be a day that that chapter of your life begins to close and you open up a new chapter? I think if you're open to it, I'm sure the Lord would show you how to close that chapter, and He could be a great help to you in opening a new chapter as you move on. The only question you have to answer is, will you let Him?